Picture this. You're walking through a dense forest, the kind where sunlight barely touches the ground. The air smells of damp earth and pine, and somewhere in the distance, a deer rustles through the underbrush. But then, a snap of a twig, a flash of movement. Suddenly, armed men emerge from the shadows, their faces grim. You've just committed a crime punishable by mutilation or worse. Why? Because in medieval England, the very act of stepping into this forest without the king's permission could cost you your hand, your eyes, or even your life. This wasn't just a woodland, it was the king's private hunting ground, guarded by laws so brutal they turned nature itself into a weapon of control. Welcome to the shadowy world of medieval forest laws, where monarchs didn't just rule over people, they ruled over every tree, every animal, and every blade of grass. These laws weren't about conservation or fairness, they were about power. From the moment William the Conqueror carved up England after his victory in 1066, forests became royal property, and anyone who dared to hunt, forage, or even gather firewood there faced draconian punishments. But the story doesn't end with severed hands and terrified peasants. These laws reshaped entire societies, twisted ecosystems, and left a legacy so deep that traces of it still linger in how we manage land and wildlife today. So how did a system so oppressive begin? And why did kings care so much about controlling forests? The answers reveal a darker side of medieval life, where nature wasn't a shared resource but a royal monopoly. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel how these laws were enforced with terrifying efficiency, how they sparked rebellions, and how they accidentally laid the groundwork for modern conservation, even though their original purpose was anything but noble. By the time we're done, you'll never look at a forest the same way again, because this isn't just history, it's a warning about what happens when power decides who gets to belong in nature and who doesn't. Let's begin. To understand how medieval kings turned forests into instruments of control, we need to step back to the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. When William the Conqueror seized the English throne, he didn't just inherit a kingdom, he saw an opportunity to reshape it entirely. Forests, in his eyes, weren't merely landscapes, they were treasure chests of resources and symbols of dominance. Within years of his victory, William declared vast swaths of England as royal forest, a term that had little to do with trees and everything to do with power. These areas could be heathland, marshes, or even villages, anything the crown claimed for its exclusive use. The genius and cruelty of this system lay in its ambiguity. By not limiting forests to woodland, William ensured that nearly any valuable land could be swallowed into the royal domain overnight. Imagine waking up to find your family's farmland suddenly off limits because the king fancied hunting there. This wasn't just about sport, it was economic warfare. Timber for shipbuilding, game for feasts, honey for trade, all became royal monopolies. Under Henry Roman II, the laws grew even more expansive, with nearly a third of southern England falling under forest jurisdiction at their peak. But why go to such lengths? The answer reveals a medieval power play. Hunting wasn't just a pastime for kings, it was a performance of authority. When nobles saw monarchs tracking deer through these reserves, they weren't just witnessing a hunt, they were being reminded of who controlled the land and everything on it. The laws also served as a financial trap. Fines for violating forest boundaries poured wealth into the crown's coffers, while the threat of mutilation kept dissent in check. It was a system designed to profit from fear, turning nature into a stage for royal supremacy. What's often overlooked is how these laws redefined the very concept of ownership. Before Norman rule, many forests were common land, shared by villagers for grazing and foraging. William's declaration erased centuries of tradition with a stroke of his pen, teaching his new subjects a brutal lesson. The land no longer belonged to those who worked it, it belonged to the man who could take it by force. This shift didn't just change landscapes, it rewrote the social contract, planting the seeds for centuries of conflict between rulers and the ruled. The royal forests of medieval England weren't just hunting grounds, they were carefully staged theaters of power. Picture a sprawling landscape where every rustling leaf and fleeing deer served as a reminder of the king's absolute authority. Deer, especially red and fallow, weren't mere animals. They were living trophies, their pursuit a ritual that separated the nobility from everyone else. Boar hunting, even more dangerous, became a test of courage reserved for the elite. The forest wasn't simply land, it was a stage where kings performed their dominance, and the audience was the entire kingdom. What made these reserves so effective as tools of control was their sheer scale. At their peak, royal forests covered nearly a quarter of England, swallowing up villages, farmlands, and entire communities. Boundaries weren't just lines on a map, they were marked by solemn ceremonies called perambulations, where officials would walk the edges, declaring the king's domain to gathered crowds. Stone markers, some still standing today, bore warnings in Latin. These woods belonged to the crown. Trespassing wasn't just illegal, it was an act of defiance against the king himself. But the real terror lay in enforcement. Foresters, armed with bows and blades, patrolled the woods like shadows. Their loyalty was bought with privileges, exemption from taxes, rights to gather firewood, making them ruthless enforcers. Poachers didn't just risk fines, they faced blinding, the severing of hands, or worse. Records from the reign of Henry Roman II describe men hanged for taking a single deer, their bodies left at forest edges as grim reminders. Even dogs weren't spared. The law demanded their claws be ripped out to prevent them from chasing game. Yet the cruelty had a purpose beyond punishment. These laws created a climate where fear seeped into daily life. A peasant hearing a stag's cry at dusk wouldn't dare follow the sound, not just because of the animal, but because of what lurked in the trees, the ever-watchful eyes of the king's men. The forest became a place of whispered rumors where ordinary people traded stories of disappearances and mutilations. It wasn't just about protecting deer, it was about ensuring no one forgot who held the real power. The irony, many of these untouchable royal forests were already managed landscapes. Villages were raised to create hunting grounds, and peasants were forced to clear underbrush not for their own use, but to improve the king's chase. The very people banned from hunting were made to maintain the ideal habitat for game. This twisted balance of destruction and cultivation reveals the true heart of the system. Nature existed to serve the crown, and people existed to serve nature only as the king's laborers. Symbolism bled into every detail. Hunting season wasn't random, it aligned with political events like the arrival of foreign dignitaries. A successful hunt was a display of the kingdom's wealth and the monarch's vitality. Chroniclers wrote of kings who personally tracked wounded stags for miles, their perseverance framed as a metaphor for ruling. Even the animals played their part. Deer were selectively bred within enclosed deer parks to ensure robust herds, while wolves were hunted to extinction for daring to compete with the king's right to kill. By the time of the Plantagenets, the system had grown so bloated that corruption festered. Nobles bribed foresters to turn a blind eye to their illegal hunts, while peasants starved as their crops were trampled by royal game. The very excess meant to showcase power began to undermine it, sparking rebellions that would eventually force kings to loosen their grip. But for centuries, the royal forest stood as monuments to a simple, brutal truth. In medieval England, even nature bowed to the crown. If you were caught with a bowstring in your pocket or fresh venison in your hut, your fate was sealed under medieval forest law. The punishments weren't designed to fit the crime, they were crafted to send a message. A first-time poacher might lose a hand or an eye, but repeat offenders faced the gallows. Records from the 12th century describe men hanged from oak trees at the forest's edge, their bodies left to rot as warnings. Even the tools of the trade were destroyed. Axes used to cut royal timber were confiscated and publicly smashed. The cruelty was deliberate. Kings understood that fear traveled faster than any royal decree. But physical mutilation was just the beginning. The financial penalties could ruin entire families. A peasant caught gathering firewood might owe a year's wages in fines, plunging their household into debt. Fines were calculated with cruel precision. Taking a deer could cost you 10 times more than stealing a sheep, because the crime wasn't theft, it was an insult to the crown. The infamous forest courts or ayers operated like traveling circuses of intimidation. Judges arrived with armed escorts, summoning entire villages to bear witness. Confessions were often extracted through torture. Suspected poachers might be forced to hold red-hot irons, with their burns serving as divine judgment. Even animals weren't spared. Dogs living near royal forests had their front claws hacked off to prevent them from chasing game. The law specified the exact method, a heated blade to cauterize the wounds, showing how meticulously cruelty was codified. Huntsmen kept registers of local dogs, and inspections were routine. A clawed dog found in the forest meant a fine for its owner, or worse. This wasn't just about preventing hunting, it was about breaking the bond between humans and animals, stripping peasants of any advantage against the king's game. The psychological terror ran deeper than the physical harm. Punishments were often public spectacles. A man blinded for poaching might be paraded through nearby towns, his empty sockets proof of the crown's reach. Whippings took place at crossroads where travelers would spread tales of what they'd seen. The goal was to turn fear into compliance, to make people police themselves. Neighbors reported suspicious activity, not out of loyalty, but to avoid being implicated. The forest became a place of whispered accusations, where even children understood the cost of defiance. Yet the system's brutality contained the seeds of its own downfall. As punishments grew more extreme, so did resentment. Villagers began hiding poachers, forging alliances against foresters. Some turned to folklore, casting outlaw hunters like Robin Hood as heroes. The very terror meant to enforce control eventually fueled resistance, proving that even the darkest laws couldn't extinguish the human instinct to push back. For peasants living near royal forests, every rustling leaf could signal danger. The laws transformed daily survival into a high-stakes game. Gathering firewood meant scanning the tree line for foresters, and a child chasing a rabbit might bring ruin to their family. Entire villages vanished overnight when declared royal hunting grounds, their residents forced to abandon homes and fields with no compensation. Those allowed to stay faced a life of relentless scrutiny. Foresters patrolled constantly, inspecting bundles of kindling or searching homes for hidden game. Even the smoke from a chimney could draw suspicion. Was that a cooking fire or someone illegally roasting venison? The economic toll was devastating. Timber, a vital resource for building and tools, was off limits unless purchased at inflated royal prices. Peasants watched as oaks that once shaded their livestock were felled for royal ships while their own roofs rotted. Honey from wild beehives, a rare source of sweetness, became crown property. With forests locked away, families lost access to medicinal herbs, wild greens that supplemented meager harvests, and fur for winter clothing. Starvation loomed when royal deer herds trampled crops. Knowing retaliation against the animals was forbidden, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Some risked midnight hunts, using silent snares instead of bows to avoid detection. Others became experts at hiding evidence, burying deer bones, disguising meat as pork, or smuggling timber under loads of hay. These small acts of defiance kept communities alive but came with constant dread. The forest, once a communal larder, had become a gilded cage where every rustle might be an informant. When rebellions like the Peasants Revolt erupted in 1381, forest grievances fueled the fury. Rebels burned royal lodges, hacked down boundary markers, and symbolically feasted on poached venison in clear view. Their demands included dismantling forest courts and restoring traditional foraging rights, proof that these laws weren't just inconveniences but existential threats. Though the revolt was crushed, its legacy lingered in whispered ballads and covert forest rituals passed through generations. The psychological weight was as crushing as the laws themselves. Parents taught children to fear the woods, breaking centuries-old bonds with the land. Stories of forest spirits multiplied not as whimsical tales, but as coded warnings about the king's unseen watchers. This severing of people from nature created a trauma that outlasted the laws themselves, echoing in later enclosures and land disputes. The royal forest wasn't just stolen land, it was stolen identity, turning self-sufficient communities into trespassers on their own soil. Yet the very oppression meant to isolate peasants sometimes forged unexpected solidarity. Villagers developed intricate warning systems, a certain bird call when foresters approached, or laundry hung in patterns signaling safe paths. Black markets for forest goods created covert economies where even local gentry might trade, blurring class lines. These survival networks revealed a truth kings never anticipated. When pushed to the brink, people don't just endure, they adapt, conspire, and remember. The forest laws aimed to control nature, but they couldn't control human ingenuity. While peasants faced mutilation for gathering firewood, the nobility and clergy operated under an entirely different set of rules. Wealth and connections transformed forest laws from iron shackles into silk ropes tight enough to control the masses, but loose enough to spare the privileged. Monasteries, with their political influence, frequently obtained royal charters allowing monks to hunt deer or harvest timber within designated areas. These weren't small concessions. Entire abbeys, like those of the Cistercian order, secured vast forest tracts where they bred game and sold hunting rights to wealthy patrons. The irony was stark. The same church that preached humility operated private hunting preserves under the king's seal. Noble families played the system with even more brazenness. Lords who outwardly enforced forest laws as royal appointees often hosted lavish hunts on the sly. Records from the 13th century reveal how barons paid off foresters with silver or land grants to ignore illegal hunting parties. Some took it further, like the Earl of Leicester, who allegedly kept a secret kennel of hunting dogs disguised as livestock guardians. Corruption became so rampant that royal inspectors complained of nobles replacing poached deer with stolen cattle to hide shortages. The unspoken truth: forest laws were less about protecting nature than maintaining a hierarchy where elites could bend the rules while commoners bore the brunt of punishment. This hypocrisy didn't go unnoticed. Peasant ballads mocked the double standard, with one surviving verse sneering, "The bishop's spear fells the king's deer, while my son hangs for a rabbit." Resentment festered, particularly when nobles used their exemptions to profit. Some monasteries turned forest rights into lucrative businesses, charging peasants exorbitant fees for acorns to feed pigs or deadwood for fuel. The church's moral authority suffered when abbots demanded labor from villagers to maintain their private game reserves. effectively forcing starving families to nurture animals they couldn't hunt. Yet not all clerics condoned the system. Radical friars like those in the Franciscan order openly condemned forest laws as unchristian theft of God's bounty. Sermons comparing royal forests to the greed of biblical pharaohs circulated in market towns, subtly fueling dissent. When the Bishop of Hereford intervened to spare a group of poachers from hanging in 1289, it sparked a brief but fierce debate about whether divine law trumped royal decrees. These cracks in the facade showed how the church's role was deeply conflicted, simultaneously upholding and undermining the system. The nobility's manipulations went beyond mere poaching. Clever lords exploited legal loopholes, like the rule allowing hunting on horseback if riders accidentally trampled game with their horses' hooves. Others hosted so-called training hunts where hounds were supposedly being schooled, conveniently resulting in piles of fresh venison, the real masterstroke. Nobles began appointing their own sons as foresters, turning enforcement into a family enterprise. By the 14th century, some royal forests were effectively privatized fiefdoms, where elites hunted at will while peasants faced the gallows for scraping bark off a tree. This systemic corruption had unintended consequences. As resentment grew, so did solidarity among lower classes. Villagers who once informed on poachers now sheltered them, seeing nobles' abuses as proof the laws were unjust. Underground networks emerged, with butchers secretly processing royal game and innkeepers serving mystery meat stews. The very inequality meant to reinforce control began eroding it, proving that oppression, when too blatantly unfair, sows the seeds of its own resistance. Amid this tension, the church's dual role became increasingly unsustainable. While some clergy benefited from royal favors, others risked their lives advocating for reform. When the radical preacher John Ball declared during the Peasants' Revolt that forests were made for all by God, he wasn't just demanding rights, he was invoking a moral framework that even kings couldn't easily dismiss. This ideological battleground, where divine justice clashed with royal privilege, would eventually help fracture the very foundation of forest laws. England's forest laws may have been the most brutal, but the idea of controlling nature to showcase power was far from unique. Across medieval Europe, kings and emperors crafted their own versions of royal dominion over woodlands, each adapting the concept to their political needs. In France, Charlemagne's Capitulary de Villiers, a series of decrees issued around the year 800, laid the groundwork for later forest control. His rules weren't just about hunting, they mandated how forests should be managed for timber, fodder, and even beekeeping. But it was the Capetian kings who turned these practical guidelines into tools of oppression. By the 12th century, French monarchs had declared vast forêts royales, where poaching a stag could mean losing your eyes or your life. Germany's emperors took a different approach. Instead of blanket laws, they carved out ban-forced, exclusive hunting reserves where only the imperial court could pursue game. Local lords who displeased the crown might find their own woodland suddenly reclassified as imperial property, a neat trick for punishing rivals. The wild ban, or hunting ban, was so strictly enforced that peasants caught setting traps for wolves which threatened livestock still faced fines for disturbing the king's peace. One chronicle from the Rhineland tells of a village forced to collectively pay a year's harvest in grain after someone took a boar that had been ravaging their fields. Up in Scandinavia, kings like Magnus Eriksson of Sweden used forest laws to solidify their rule over fractious nobles. In the 1400s, his Skogsordning decreed that all untouched wilderness belonged to the crown, effectively nationalizing resources like timber and iron ore. Poachers in Norway faced utlegd outlawry, which meant anyone could kill them without consequence. But there was a twist. Some Norse sagas suggest communities occasionally ignored these laws, hiding poachers and sharing the meat. The harsh climate made survival a collective effort, and royal edicts sometimes clashed with older traditions of communal resource sharing. Poland's system was perhaps the most organized. Specialized officials called loci master hunters patrolled royal forests with teams of armed retainers. Their records, meticulously kept in ledgers called ksigi loiki, detailed everything from the number of deer born each spring to the exact punishments meted out to offenders. One entry from 1532 notes a peasant sentenced to 10 lashes for gathering mushrooms in a royal grove, proof that even the most mundane activities fell under suspicion. What's striking is how these systems echoed one another despite cultural differences. Whether in the olive groves of Sicily or the pine forests of Muscovy, rulers understood that controlling nature meant controlling people. Timber for ships, game for feasts, land for taxes, forests were economic engines wrapped in the pageantry of royal sport. Yet England's laws stood apart in their sheer vindictiveness. While French peasants might bribe a gamekeeper and German villagers could sometimes appeal to local lords, English forest courts showed little mercy. The scale was different too. At their peak, royal forests covered less than 5% of France but over 25% of England. These parallels reveal a medieval truth: forests were never just trees and deer. They were political chessboards where kings demonstrated their reach, punished enemies, and extracted wealth. The specific rules varied, but the message was universal: step out of line, and even the land itself would testify against you. Ironically, the very laws designed to protect royal game reshaped England's ecosystems in ways kings never anticipated. Deer populations exploded under forest laws, not because of careful stewardship, but because predators were systematically erased. Wolves, once common across the island, were hunted to extinction by the 15th century, not for threatening livestock, but for daring to compete with the king's right to kill. Lynxes, bears, and even wildcats vanished from royal forests, their absence creating a lopsided world where prey animals thrived unchecked. This wasn't conservation, it was a massacre masquerading as management. The consequences rippled through the landscape. Without predators to cull weak or sick deer, herds grew unnaturally dense. Overgrazing stripped forests of underbrush, leaving saplings vulnerable and soil exposed. In some areas, the ground became so compacted by hooves that rainwater pooled instead of soaking in, creating stagnant marshes where healthy woodlands once stood. Royal foresters, tasked with maintaining ideal hunting conditions, responded with brutal efficiency, burning sections of forest to stimulate new growth for deer, while uprooting plants deemed useless to game. The result: monocultures of greenery where only the king's preferred species flourished, and biodiversity withered. Yet the law's ecological impact went deeper than habitat destruction. Entire food chains unraveled. Birds that relied on wolf-killed carcasses for winter survival disappeared from royal woods. Insects dependent on diverse plant life dwindled, affecting everything from pollination to soil health. Even the deer suffered. Overpopulation led to starvation in harsh winters, with records describing emaciated stags stumbling into villages. The crown's solution: more culls by royal huntsmen, perpetuating a cycle where human interference replaced natural balance. Some historians argue these laws were medieval attempts at conservation, pointing to clauses that fined illegal logging or protected young deer. But this overlooks the crucial distinction. True conservation manages ecosystems for their own sake, while forest laws managed nature solely for human, specifically royal, gain. The proof lies in what happened outside hunting grounds, common lands where peasants still foraged, often retained healthier ecosystems precisely because they weren't micromanaged. Ancient oaks stood taller in village woods than in royal forests, where selective cutting for shipbuilding left gaps in the canopy, the most haunting legacy. How these distorted ecosystems endured long after the laws faded. Deer parks, originally fenced hunting reserves, became status symbols for aristocrats, preserving artificial herds into the modern era. Meanwhile, the loss of apex predators like wolves created imbalances still felt today. Overbrowsing deer hinder forest regeneration in parts of England, a problem ecologists trace directly to medieval hunting policies. Even the term wildlife management carries echoes of that era, reminding us how deeply human control can alter nature's rhythm. What began as a king's whim ended up rewriting England's ecological script for centuries. The forests may have belonged to the crown, but their scars were borne by the land itself, a silent testament to what happens when power dictates nature's boundaries without understanding its balance. Forest laws didn't just dictate who could hunt or gather wood, they rewrote the very idea of who owned the land itself. Before kings declared vast swaths of England as royal forests, many of these areas were common lands where villagers grazed livestock, collected firewood, and foraged freely. But with the stroke of a royal decree, centuries of shared tradition vanished. Suddenly, the oak that had provided acorns for generations of pigs belonged to the crown. The stream where families fished became a royal waterway. This wasn't just a change in rules, it was a revolution in how society viewed nature, transforming communal resources into private property. The process of enclosure, walling off common lands for exclusive use, found its blueprint in forest laws. Kings didn't just fence off woodlands, they created a legal framework that justified taking land from the many and giving it to the few. Royal surveyors mapped boundaries with meticulous precision, erecting markers that declared entire ecosystems as crown possessions. Villagers caught inside these borders faced impossible choices: abandon their homes or live as trespassers on land they'd worked for generations. The Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's great inventory of England, became a tool for legitimizing these seizures, recording forests as royal assets alongside castles and taxes. This shift didn't just benefit the monarchy. Wealthy nobles, eager to mimic royal power, began enclosing their own lands, evicting peasants under the guise of improvement. By the 13th century, what started as a royal hunting policy had metastasized into a broader assault on communal rights. The Statute of Merton in 1235 even legalized enclosure if lords left sufficient land for peasants, a vague term that became a loophole for greed. Common pastures shrank, shared meadows vanished, and families who once sustained themselves from the land became laborers on someone else's estate. The legal precedents set by forest laws reverberate today. Modern eminent domain, where government seize private land for public use, traces its roots to medieval kings declaring forests as crown property. The idea that land can be unilaterally reassigned by authority, rather than custom or community agreement, began here. Even the concept of public land carries echoes of this history, as debates rage over who truly benefits from state-controlled resources. Are national parks the new royal forests, preserving nature for some while restricting access for others? Peasant resistance to enclosure was fierce but fragmented. Some villages sued in royal courts, arguing ancient rights of common use. Others took direct action, tearing down fences, smuggling timber, or secretly grazing animals in forbidden areas. The most famous rebellion, the Peasants Revolt of 1381, included demands to dismantle enclosures and restore common access. Though crushed, these protests planted early seeds of land reform, reminding elites that ownership without consent breeds unrest. The legacy of these battles lingers in modern property disputes. From Scottish crofters fighting for grazing rights to indigenous communities reclaiming ancestral lands, the question remains, who does nature truly belong to? Forest laws taught us that land ownership isn't just about deeds and boundaries, it's about power and who gets to wield it. As we grapple with climate change and conservation, these medieval conflicts offer a stark lesson. When control over nature becomes too concentrated, the repercussions last for centuries. Behind the scenes, enforcing these sweeping claims required more than just threats. It demanded an entire bureaucracy. From foresters prowling the woods to clerks tallying every fallen tree, the administration of forest laws became a machine of control, one that would shape how governments manage resources to this day. Running the royal forests was like operating a shadow government, one with its own courts, tax collectors, and armed enforcers. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the foresters, rough men who knew every deer path and hiding spot in the woods. Armed with bows and axes, they weren't just gamekeepers, they were tacksmen, spies, and sometimes executioners. Their daily patrols served as mobile checkpoints, demanding proof from anyone carrying firewood or herbs. But their real power lay in discretion. They could turn a blind eye for a bribe or invent charges to settle personal grudges. Above them stood the verderers, local landowners appointed to oversee forest courts. These weren't dignified judges but political operators, chosen for loyalty over fairness. Court sessions resembled theatrical interrogations, where suspects were grilled about missing deer or mysteriously felled oaks. Verderers kept detailed records not of justice served but of fines owed. A single blotched entry in their ledgers could mean the difference between a warning and a severed hand. Then there was the justice in ire, the most dreaded figure in the system. This roving judge arrived like a storm, summoning entire villages to account for every missing twig or trampled sapling. Eyewitness accounts describe him seated beneath a canopy of oak branches, his clerks scribbling confessions extracted through ordeal. Hot iron tests, where suspects carried burning metal to prove innocence, left many with permanent scars. The Ire's decisions were final, his punishments theatrical. A man might be hanged from the very tree he was accused of harming. Corruption festered at every level. Foresters sold venison on the black market, verderers took bribes to lose court records, and even the Ire's clerks padded fines for personal profit. The pipe rolls, massive parchment scrolls detailing forest revenues, tell a telling story. Columns of silver payments from peasants sit alongside suspiciously low fines for nobles. One entry from 1292 notes a knight fined 2 barrels of wine for poaching, while a charcoal burner lost his home for gathering dead wood. This bureaucracy's true innovation was its paperwork. Every stag birth, fallen branch, and poaching incident was logged in triplicate. The Crown knew exactly how many deer grazed in Sherwood Forest or how many oaks grew in Dean, not for conservation but for profit. Modern bureaucracies, from tax agencies to environmental regulators, inherit this dual legacy: meticulous oversight paired with the potential for abuse. Yet the system's greatest weakness was its own greed. As fines grew heavier and corruption more blatant, even loyal subjects began to question its legitimacy. The stage was set for rebellion, not with swords, but with quills and petitions demanding reform. Resistance to forest laws didn't begin with armed revolts. It started in the quiet defiance of everyday survival. A peasant hiding venison in a hollow tree, a wife smuggling acorns in her apron, a blacksmith forging unmarked tools to avoid royal taxes. These small acts of rebellion chipped away at the Crown's control. But by the early 13th century, that simmering resentment boiled over into demands for systemic change. The Magna Carta, often celebrated for curbing royal power, contained a little-known clause demanding the disafforestation of lands seized since Henry Roman II reign. Though King John initially ignored this provision, the seed was planted. Even nobles grew weary of the king's unchecked dominion over nature. The real breakthrough came 2 years later with the Charter of the Forest in 1217. This remarkable document, overshadowed by its famous predecessor, restored traditional rights like foraging for firewood, grazing livestock, and even hunting small game in royal woods. For the first time, the law acknowledged that forests weren't just royal playgrounds, they were vital to survival. Villagers could now collect fallen branches, dig clay for repairs, and let pigs root for acorns without fear of mutilation. The charter even banned the death penalty for poaching deer, replacing it with fines scaled to the offender's means. It was a watershed moment, proving that even the most entrenched systems could bend under pressure. Yet justice moved slowly in medieval England. Corrupt officials dragged their feet implementing reforms, and many foresters continued extracting bribes by threatening villagers with outdated punishments. The gap between law and practice fueled explosive unrest. When the Peasants Revolt erupted in 1381, forest grievances ranked high among rebel demands. Wat Tyler's followers didn't just burn tax records, they targeted royal deer parks, symbolically feasting on venison in open defiance. One chronicler described rebels in Essex planting trees upside down, a visceral protest against the very idea of royal forests. The revolt's brutal suppression didn't erase its impact. Kings began realizing that enforcing draconian laws cost more than the revenues they generated. By the 15th century, monarchs quietly shifted priorities, selling off forest lands to fund wars, granting logging licenses to raise quick cash, and turning a blind eye to petty poaching. The once feared forest courts convened less frequently, their harsh judgments replaced by negotiated fines. Even the physical boundaries blurred as villagers gradually reclaimed strips of land, their plowshares eroding the king's markers. This wasn't just a victory for peasants, it reshaped English governance. The Charter of the Forest set a precedent that resources couldn't be monopolized indefinitely, influencing later movements like the Diggers of the English Civil War. More subtly, it proved that environmental access was intertwined with human rights, a concept echoing in modern debates over public lands. The slow unraveling of forest laws revealed a timeless truth. No system of control, no matter how brutal, can withstand the collective will of people fighting for their place in the natural world. By the time Henry Roman VIII seized England's monasteries in the 1530s, the once feared forest laws were already crumbling. The Tudor era didn't just change religion, it reshaped how the crown viewed land itself. With the rise of wool trade and crop rotation, enclosed farmland became far more valuable than royal hunting grounds. Monarchs desperate for cash began selling off forest tracts to fund their armies and palaces. What couldn't be sold was often leased to nobles or stripped of timber for shipbuilding. The New Forest, William the Conqueror's prized hunting domain, saw entire sections cleared for farmland under Charles I, not by peasant rebels but by royal decree. Yet the laws didn't vanish overnight. Like shadows lingering at dusk, remnants of the old system persisted. Royal deer parks, those walled enclosures where nobles staged genteel hunts, became fashionable status symbols long after wild forests lost their terror. Some, like Richmond Park in London, still operate today, living museums of medieval privilege repurposed for picnics and bird watching. The office of verderer survived too, though its duties dwindled to ceremonial roles. In the Forest of Dean, locals still elect verderers to oversee common rights, a faint echo of the courts that once sentenced poachers to mutilation. The decline wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. As Parliament gained power, the idea that a king could claim nature itself grew increasingly absurd. When James I tried reviving forest courts to squeeze money from nobles, the backlash was swift. Judges ruled that centuries-old boundaries couldn't be enforced without local consent. By the Civil War, forests had become political bargaining chips. Charles I famously traded woodland rights for military support, only to lose both his forests and his head. What's often overlooked is how this unraveling affected ordinary people. Villages bordering former royal forests found themselves caught in a new tug of war between landlords and speculators. Some commoners who'd fought for generations to regain foraging rights now faced enclosure by private owners. The very peasants who cheered the law's demise sometimes discovered that nature, once freed from royal control, could still be locked away by wealth. The Tudor and Stuart periods also saw an unexpected ecological shift. As enforcement waned, deer populations once artificially protected plummeted from overhunting. Wolves, already extinct, were replaced by a new predator, the market. Timber became a commodity traded across Europe, with oak from former royal forests building everything from London's theatres to Spanish galleons. The land itself transformed as centuries of managed hunting grounds gave way to patchworks of farmland, pasture, and coppice. This transition mirrored broader changes in English society. The divine right of kings, like the divine right over forests, was being questioned. When parliamentarians chopped down Charles I's prized trees at Greenwich to build warships, it wasn't just about timber. It was a statement that no monarch could monopolize nature forever. The Forest Law's slow death became a proxy for England's larger struggle between absolute rule and shared governance. Even in their twilight, these laws left scars. Disputes over forest boundaries resurfaced during the Enclosure Acts, proving how deeply royal claims had muddied land ownership. Modern property maps still show odd juts and gaps where medieval perambulations once ran. And in places like Epping Forest, centuries-old common rights suddenly remembered became legal weapons against 19th century developers, a twist William the Conqueror never anticipated. The most ironic legacy, those oppressive laws accidentally preserved what unchecked exploitation might have destroyed. While Europe's unregulated woodlands were stripped bare, England's royal forests retained ancient trees and ecosystems, not because kings cared for nature, but because their greed demanded sustainable hunting stocks. This unintended consequence would later inspire a very different kind of forest law, one aimed not at control but at conservation. The echoes of medieval forest laws whisper through modern conservation efforts in ways that would astonish their original architects. While kings once walled off woodlands for personal sport, today's protected areas from Yellowstone to the Serengeti use similar boundaries for radically different ends. The framework is eerily familiar. Designated zones where human activity is restricted, patrolled by rangers instead of foresters, with penalties for those who break the rules. But here the similarities end. Where medieval laws sought to exclude all but the privileged few, contemporary conservation aims to balance public access with ecological protection, a philosophy that transforms exclusion into stewardship. This evolution didn't happen overnight. Early naturalists like John Muir initially championed the creation of wilderness preserves modeled on aristocratic hunting grounds, complete with gates and guards. Even America's first national parks displaced indigenous communities, mirroring the medieval displacement of peasants. Yet over time, the ethos shifted. The 1916 National Park Service Act enshrined a revolutionary idea that protected lands should serve the enjoyment of future generations. This subtle phrase marked a seismic break from the medieval model. Nature no longer existed solely for elite pleasure, but as a shared inheritance. The tools of control, however, remain strikingly parallel. Medieval foresters kept meticulous records of deer populations. Modern ecologists track wolf packs and migratory birds with GPS collars. Verderers once fined villagers for cutting timber. Today, rangers issue citations for littering or off-trail hiking. Even the concept of buffer zones around core protected areas mirrors the concentric rings of medieval forests, where outer belts allowed limited use while inner sanctuaries remained untouched. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in the unintended consequences of royal greed. By artificially preserving deer herds, medieval kings accidentally maintained habitats that might otherwise have been cleared for farmland. Ancient oaks in England's New Forest, some dating to William the Conqueror's era, owe their survival to centuries of royal protection. Modern conservationists now study these landscapes as baselines for ecological restoration, proving that even the most oppressive systems can leave behind fragments of resilience. Yet the contrasts reveal progress. Where forest laws punished peasants for subsistence hunting, modern policies work with local communities to develop sustainable alternatives. Camera traps replace iron shackles, education supplants terror. The shift from punishment to partnership reflects a hard-won truth. Lasting conservation requires consent, not coercion. This doesn't mean the old tensions have vanished. Debates over rewilding vs. rural livelihoods or tourism vs. preservation replay medieval conflicts with new actors, proof that balancing human needs with nature's rights remains an unfinished revolution. The most poetic twist: some of Europe's rarest species now thrive in former royal hunting grounds. The bison reintroduced to Poland's Białowieża forest, once a private reserve for kings, roam freely alongside tourists. In England, conservation groups have repurposed medieval deer parks as biodiversity hotspots, their ancient boundaries now protecting endangered beetles and orchids. These landscapes, once symbols of exclusion, have become testaments to redemption, where the ghosts of forest laws finally serve a purpose their creators never imagined. Contrary to what many assume, medieval forest laws had nothing to do with protecting nature. They WERE Chinese letter 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 Chinese letter. This misconception likely stems from modern projections, where we see protected areas as environmental havens. But in the Middle Ages, the crown's obsession with controlling forests was purely about dominance and profit. Kings didn't care if deer overgrazed or if wolves went extinct. They cared that every animal and tree reinforced their authority. The laws were less about stewardship and more about reminding subjects that even the air beneath an oak tree belonged to the monarch. Another persistent myth suggests that royal forests were completely forbidden zones, locked away from common use. In reality, many operated under intricate shared use agreements. Villagers might be permitted to gather fallen branches or let pigs forage for acorns, but only after paying fees or performing labor for the crown. Some forests even allowed controlled hunting of smaller game like hares, provided locals used approved methods like nets rather than bows. These concessions weren't acts of generosity. They were calculated moves to prevent outright rebellion while keeping resources flowing to the crown. The illusion of access masked a system designed to profit from every twig and hoofprint. Even the enforcement of these laws was far from uniform. While rulers like Henry Roman II zealously expanded forest boundaries, others showed blatant indifference. Richard the Lionheart, preoccupied with crusades and continental wars, treated England's forests as ATMs, selling off logging rights to fund his campaigns. Records show entire swaths of woodland cleared under his reign with no regard for hunting reserves. Meanwhile, King John famously used forest laws as political weapons, seizing lands from disloyal nobles under flimsy pretexts. This inconsistency reveals a key truth. The system was never about principled governance. It was a flexible tool for control, tightened or loosened based on a king's whims and wallet. The most dangerous misconception that these laws were universally hated. In reality, elites often supported them not out of fear but opportunity. Clever nobles exploited loopholes like hosting training hunts where their hounds accidentally chased royal stags. Monasteries bribed officials to secure resource rights, turning sacred abbeys into covert logging operations. Even some peasants benefited, with foresters' families enjoying exemptions in exchange for loyalty. This complexity gets lost in the Robin Hood folklore, where forest laws are simplistically vilified. The real story is messier, a system that corrupted as much as it controlled, where complicity was often the price of survival. Peeling away these myths exposes the law's true purpose, not to protect nature but to redefine it. By declaring forests as royal domains, kings didn't just claim land, they reshaped how society perceived ownership itself. A peasant watching a stag bound across a field no longer saw a potential meal, but a walking symbol of the crown's reach. Trees weren't community resources, they were the king's future warships. This psychological conquest, more than any fence or fine, was the system's most enduring victory. Archaeology now offers tangible proof of these contradictions: boundary stones engraved with royal insignia lying just meters from hidden poachers' pits. The physical evidence doesn't just correct misconceptions, it forces us to ask why we created them in the first place. Perhaps it's easier to imagine medieval kings as early environmentalists than to face the uncomfortable truth. Their laws were never about the forest. They were about who gets to decide what the forest is for. Beneath the moss and leaf litter of England's ancient woodlands, archaeologists have uncovered the physical scars of medieval forest laws, silent witnesses to a system that reshaped nature itself. Boundary stones etched with royal insignia still lie half-buried along old perambulation routes, their weathered surfaces marking where common land became crown property with a single decree. Excavations at sites like the New Forest reveal more than just markers. They've exposed the foundations of royal hunting lodges, their grand fireplaces and wine cellars, a stark contrast to the makeshift poachers' camps found nearby. These hidden clearings, littered with charred deer bones and crude snares, tell a story of desperation, people risking mutilation for a mouthful of meat. The bones themselves are perhaps the most damning evidence. At royal sites, deer remains outnumber those of livestock by 20 to 1, their skeletons showing meticulous butchery marks from skilled huntsmen. But dig deeper and darker patterns emerge. Wolf bones vanish entirely from the archaeological record by the 15th century, while lynx and bear remains dwindled to nothing. This wasn't natural extinction, it was systematic eradication, with bounties paid for every predator killed to protect the king's game. Even the soil tells a story. Pollen samples from former forest villages show abrupt shifts from crop grains to shade-tolerant plants as fields were abandoned under royal seizure. In some places, the land reverted to near wilderness, not because kings cherished nature, but because displaced peasants could no longer tend it. Among the most haunting finds are the small personal items lost or hidden in these woods: a child's wooden doll wedged between tree roots, a rusted knife buried beneath a stream bank. These artifacts humanize the law's toll, hinting at families who vanished when their homes were swallowed into royal domains. Metal detectors have turned up crude lead tokens near boundary stones, likely used as makeshift bribes for corrupt foresters. Each discovery peels back another layer of the forest's dual role: a stage for royal power plays and a battleground for survival. Modern technology adds startling precision to these insights. LiDAR scans reveal ghostly outlines of medieval coppicing, evidence that peasants secretly harvested young trees despite bans. Isotope analysis of deer teeth proves some herds were artificially fed during harsh winters, their privileged status etched into their very bones. Even the humble pollen grain holds revelations. A sudden spike in heather pollen at Clarendon Forest coincides with records of mass burnings ordered to create better grazing for deer. The land remembers what parchment records omit. Perhaps the most ironic legacy lies in what these laws accidentally preserved. While unprotected woodlands were cleared for farming, royal forests became time capsules of medieval ecology. Ancient oaks in Sherwood Forest, their trunks wider than chariots, owe their survival to kings who valued them as hunting landmarks. The very oppression meant to control nature ended up safeguarding fragments of a vanishing world, though never for the reasons we might wish. As we piece together these physical clues, they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The landscapes we now romanticize as wild were often sculpted by cruelty, their beauty the unintended byproduct of human conflict. These silent witnesses, stones, bones, and buried tools whisper a warning across centuries. When power decides who belongs in nature and who doesn't, the land itself becomes an archive of injustice. Yet they also hint at resilience, revealing how people carved out spaces of defiance in the shadow of the king's trees. The folklore that grew from these struggles would transform raw survival into something far more dangerous to power, a story that refused to die. Robin Hood wasn't just a character in a ballad, he was the collective scream of every peasant who'd watched their children go hungry while royal deer grew fat. The ballads of outlaws stealing from the rich and giving to the poor didn't spring from nowhere. They were folkloric revenge fantasies against forest laws. In the green depths of Sherwood, storytellers transformed poachers into heroes, their arrows striking not just deer but the very heart of royal oppression. The details were exaggerated. No, Hood probably didn't rob Prince John blind while wearing Lincoln green, but the core truth remained. Forests had become battlegrounds and the common people chose their champions. Even older tales whispered through the woods carried traces of this defiance. The green man, that leafy face carved into church walls, wasn't just a pagan holdover. To peasants barred from their ancestral woodlands, he became a symbol of nature resisting human control, a reminder that forests existed long before kings claimed them. Some scholars argue that stories of forest spirits, from will-o'-the-wisps to phantom stags, grew from displaced communities mourning lost access. A rustling in the underbrush wasn't just wind, it was the ghost of what they'd been forced to leave behind. The irony, even official culture absorbed this rebellion. Medieval mystery plays, street performances sanctioned by the church often featured wild men of the woods who mocked authority. Audiences cheered when these characters outwitted pompous lords, their laughter a safe outlet for pent-up rage. Over time, the forest outlaw archetype seeped into everything from Arthurian legends to Shakespeare's plays. In As You Like It, the Forest of Arden isn't just a setting. It's a place where social hierarchies dissolve, much as peasants dreamed they might beyond the reach of royal foresters. These stories did more than entertain, they preserved subversive truths. A ballad about a poacher's daring escape taught listeners where game trails lay hidden. Tales of fairy gold buried in forests may have hinted at real smuggling routes for illicit venison or timber. Folklore became a covert map, passed down through generations long after the original laws faded. Yet the most enduring legacy lies in how these myths shaped national identity. By the Victorian era, Robin Hood wasn't just a local hero, he was England's rebel heart, proof that tyranny could be outwitted. Modern conservation movements unknowingly echo this spirit when they fight for public access to woodlands. a battle that began not with policy papers, but with fireside stories of men who refused to let kings own the wild. But not all cultures treated forests as property to be conquered. While medieval kings walled off nature, many indigenous peoples saw woodlands as kin, a perspective that would reshape conservation centuries later. Medieval kings saw forests as private treasure chests, but indigenous cultures viewed them as living libraries, places where every plant, animal, and stream held knowledge to be shared, not seized. Where English law declared trees the property of the crown, the Maori of New Zealand spoke of Tiangaha as an ancestor, its roots intertwined with their own genealogy. In the Amazon, the Yanomami didn't divide land into parcels but mapped it by stories, where a waterfall wasn't territory to control but a spirit to honor. This fundamental difference in perspective reshaped entire ecosystems. While royal forests became monocultures of deer and fear, indigenous woodlands thrived as mosaics of biodiversity, cultivated through practices like controlled burns that renewed soil or selective harvesting that encouraged plant diversity. The contrast in governance was just as stark. Where medieval forest courts imposed rules from afar, many indigenous communities made decisions through consensus, with elders and hunters debating sustainable yields around fires rather than in stone halls. The Iroquois Confederacy's 7 generations principle weighing how today's actions would impact descendants 7 generations hence, stood in brutal contrast to King John's habit of selling off timber rights to fund next season's wars. Even the tools of enforcement diverged. Where English foresters carried blades to maim poachers, the Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest appointed forest speakers who mediated disputes with words, not weapons. Yet the most revealing difference lies in outcomes. Soil samples from pre-colonial indigenous lands show richer nutrients and greater carbon storage than European forests of the same period. Where royal hunting grounds starved villages by locking away game, indigenous stewards like the Sami of Scandinavia maintained reindeer herds through rotational grazing, ensuring both people and animals thrived. These weren't accidents of geography, but the results of philosophies that saw humans as part of nature's web, not its masters. Modern conservation is beginning to acknowledge this divide. Projects like Canada's Great Bear Rainforest now blend indigenous oversight with government protections, echoing medieval boundaries but rejecting their exclusionary logic. Rangers in Australia's Kakadu National Park learn from Aboriginal fire management techniques that prevent wildfires, methods refined over 60,000 years. Even the language is shifting. Where medieval charters spoke of the king's deer, modern treaties recognize the land's people. This uneasy fusion of old and new plays out vividly in literature, where forests have long served as metaphors for power and resistance. Shakespeare's Wildwood in A Midsummer Night's Dream becomes a realm of chaos and transformation, while Tolkien's Fangorn Forest wages war against industrial exploitation. Each story carries echoes of those medieval laws and the older, quieter wisdom they tried to erase. Shakespeare's Forest of Arden, in As You Like It, isn't just a leafy escape, it's a sly critique of royal forest laws hiding in plain sight. When Duke Senior flees to the woods declaring, "Sweet are the uses of adversity," he's not just praising nature, he's thumbing his nose at a system that turned forests into prisons. The play's banished nobles and love-struck shepherds find freedom under the trees precisely because those trees aren't claimed by a king. Shakespeare flips the script. His forest becomes a place where social hierarchies unravel, where a woman disguised as a man can woo a lord, and where justice is meted out not by royal courts, but by chance encounters and wisdom whispered through the branches. It's no coincidence that the word outlaw appears more often here than in any of his other works. The forest is where society's rules get rewritten. Centuries later, modern novels still mine this tension. In The Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Puritan wilderness echoes medieval forests, a space both feared and freeing, where Hester Prynne's forbidden love flourishes beyond the town's rigid laws. More recently, Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant uses a mist-shrouded woodland to explore collective memory and oppression, mirroring how medieval peasants might have experienced royal forests, half-remembered rites swallowed by enforced silence. Even children's literature carries traces of this legacy. The Outlaws of Sherwood by Robin McKinley reimagines the classic tale with a focus on the bureaucratic brutality of forest courts, making the sheriff's ledgers as menacing as his swords. What makes these depictions so enduring is their duality. Forests in literature are never just settings, they're battlegrounds between control and chaos. The tangled vines of A Midsummer Night's Dream confuse lovers just as forest laws confuse justice, while the dystopian woods of The Hunger Games revive medieval terrors with mutations replacing royal gamekeepers. Even Tolkien's Fangorn Forest, with its Ents rising against industrial exploitation, channels the rage of peasants watching their oaks felled for royal ships. This symbolism spills beyond fiction. Folk ballads like The Greenwood City turn anonymous poachers into mythic figures, their arrows piercing not just deer but the heart of tyranny. Contemporary fantasy games like The Witcher 3 embed forest law conflicts inside quests. Players might stumble on a village starving because a lord's hunt has cleared the woods, or a witch trial sparked by desperate accusations of deer theft. These aren't just plot devices, they're cultural memories of a time when nature was weaponized. The most poignant reinterpretations come from post-colonial literature. In The Bone People by Kerry Hulme, New Zealand's forests, once stripped by British colonists emulating royal land grabs, become sites of Maori resistance and healing. Similarly, The Overstory by Richard Powers threads medieval forest law echoes through modern environmental activism, showing how the fight to protect trees remains entangled with questions of who gets to decide their fate. What unites these stories across time is their refusal to let forests be mere backdrops. They insist that woodlands are witnesses to oppression, rebellion, and the stubborn human need to claim space under the leaves. When modern audiences cheer for Robin Hood or shudder at Game of Thrones' haunted Wolfswood, they're not just enjoying tales of adventure, they're touching a nerve that still thrums centuries later, the fear of being fenced out of nature and the longing to belong to something wilder than laws. This literary lineage doesn't just keep history alive, it reveals how forest laws shaped storytelling itself. The archetype of the outlaw hero, the trope of the magical woodland, even the narrative tension between sanctuary and danger all bear fingerprints of those medieval edicts. As we turn next to their legal legacy, remember, the laws may have faded, but the stories they spawned continue to grow, twisting through culture like ivy on an old boundary stone. The echoes of medieval forest laws still resonate in courtrooms today, shaping how we define ownership and access to nature. That centuries-old concept of royal forests, where land served one privileged class at the expense of others, ironically laid groundwork for modern environmental protections. Take the public trust doctrine, a legal principle asserting that resources like waterways and shorelines must be preserved for public use. Though it feels like a progressive idea, its roots twist back to the backlash against kings who walled off entire ecosystems. When the Charter of the Forest in 1217 restored commoners' rights to gather firewood and graze livestock, it planted the seed for later arguments that nature shouldn't be monopolized by any single entity. Today, this doctrine underpins lawsuits protecting beaches from private development and safeguarding clean air as a collective right, a quiet triumph of medieval peasant demands over royal decrees. Trespassing laws carry even more direct lineage from those ancient boundaries. The bright yellow, "No trespassing" signs posted on modern fences descend from the carved stone markers of royal forests, their Latin warnings replaced by bold block letters. But there's a crucial difference. Where medieval law punished unauthorized entry as a personal insult to the king, contemporary statutes frame it as a violation between individuals. That shift from crown-centric to property-centric thinking didn't happen overnight. Early American colonists initially treated forests as communal, much like pre-Norman England, until land speculation and timber profits birthed new exclusionary norms. The legal pendulum keeps swinging. Recent right to roam movements in Scotland and Scandinavia deliberately echo pre-feudal traditions, challenging modern enclosures with medieval precedents. Dig deeper into property law, and you'll find more ghostly imprints of forest bureaucracy. The concept of eminent domain, where governments can seize private land for public use, mirrors how kings declared forests overnight, compensating displaced villagers with nothing but threats. Zoning regulations that restrict land use in sensitive habitats, those trace back to medieval bans on clearing trees near deer breeding grounds. Even the paperwork feels familiar. Where verderers once tallied every felled oak in pipe rolls, environmental agencies now track tree cover loss via satellite. The tools have changed, but the tension remains: how to balance collective needs against private control. Perhaps the most unexpected legacy lies in wildlife management. Modern hunting licenses and seasonal restrictions evolved from royal hunting permits, though their purpose flipped from privilege to conservation. That delicate dance between use and protection, allowing controlled hunting to fund habitat preservation, still carries whispers of medieval gamekeepers who balanced deer herds for royal sport. The difference: today's debates over wolf reintroduction or fishing quotas involve public input, not royal whims. Yet the underlying question persists: who gets to decide which species thrive and which vanish? This legal evolution wasn't linear or just. Indigenous land stewardship models, sustainably honed over millennia, were brutally suppressed as European-style property laws spread globally through colonization. The same Norman concepts that crushed English peasants' rights were later weaponized against Native Americans, Maori, and Aboriginal Australians. Recognizing this dark lineage is crucial. It reveals how legal systems built on exclusion tend to replicate those patterns unless consciously corrected. Recent court victories granting rivers legal personhood in New Zealand or recognizing tribal co-management of national parks suggest a long overdue reckoning with these roots. As we turn to the economic consequences of forest laws, remember that their legal legacy isn't just about statutes and precedents. It's about how centuries of struggle over nature's ownership taught us that laws which start as tools of oppression can, through relentless challenge, become instruments of shared dignity. The next chapter in this story isn't written in ink or carved in stone, but in the choices we make about who the forests belong to today. The economic shockwaves of medieval forest laws reached far beyond poachers' gallows and starving villages. They warped entire regional economies into shadows of their potential. By declaring timber, game, and even honey as crown property, kings didn't just monopolize nature, they strangled the lifeblood of local trade. Picture a carpenter unable to source oak without paying crippling royal fees, or a tanner whose leather business collapsed because villagers could no longer hunt deer for hides. Entire industries adapted to scarcity. Butchers sold mystery meat from illegal hunts, blacksmiths crafted unmarked tools to avoid royal taxes, and cooperatives shifted from oak to inferior elm, weakening wine barrels and spoiling exports. The ripple effects reached Europe's trade hubs, where English wool merchants found themselves undercut by competitors from lands with fewer resource restrictions. Black markets became the invisible scaffolding holding up rural economies. A thriving underground network moved venison from moonlit poaching grounds to noble tables, disguised as beef in sealed wagons. Timber smuggling operations rivaled modern drug cartels in sophistication. Forest villages developed coded whistle systems to warn of approaching patrols, while dockworkers bribed officials to look the other way as firewood shipments filled with prime oak sailed to France. Even the clergy participated. Monastery ledgers from Yorkshire show donations of suspiciously well-butchered deer carcasses appearing during lean winters. This wasn't mere law-breaking, it was economic adaptation to a system that made legality impossible for ordinary people. The Crown's iron grip on resources backfired spectacularly over time. As enforcement costs ballooned, paying foresters, maintaining courts, chasing smugglers, the system became a net drain on royal coffers. Henry Roman III Treasury wasted over £3,000 annually, equivalent to millions today, chasing poachers while timber shortages crippled shipbuilding. The absurdity peaked when kings began selling exemptions to the very laws they'd created, like Edward I auctioning logging rights to fund his Scottish wars. This hypocrisy exposed the truth. Forest laws were never efficient economic policy, but blunt instruments of control that even monarchs couldn't sustain. Modern parallels abound, from colonial spice monopolies to modern water rights battles. History keeps teaching the same lesson. Hoarding essential resources breeds corruption and stagnation. Contemporary environmental policies now strive for balanced timber quotas paired with reforestation, hunting licenses funding conservation, direct responses to the medieval model's failures. Yet the tension remains: how to protect nature without replicating the exclusion that turned forests from communal sustenance into theaters of oppression. One unexpected legacy emerged from this economic chaos: the birth of early capitalism's gray areas. The same villages that once traded openly now developed covert skills, hiding contraband, forging documents, bribing officials, that later fueled England's informal economy. Some historians trace the infamous black market mentality of industrial England directly back to generations raised under forest law scarcity. When survival requires bending unjust rules, the line between criminal and entrepreneur blurs, a dynamic playing out today in communities navigating restrictive environmental policies. The most poignant economic casualties were the intangible ones. Traditional knowledge faded as foraging skills became dangerous to teach. Children no longer learned which mushrooms were edible or how to harvest medicinal bark, severing ties to ecosystems their ancestors had stewarded for centuries. This cultural bankruptcy, the loss of nature as teacher and provider, may have been forest law's most enduring economic damage, one no reform could fully repair. As we turn to gender roles within this oppressive system, remember that economic oppression was never evenly distributed. Women navigating forest law economies faced unique perils and devised ingenious survival strategies that rewrite our understanding of medieval resilience. Women navigating medieval forest laws faced a paradox. They were both shielded and shackled by their gender. While men caught poaching risked losing hands or eyes, women were more likely to face fines or public shaming. Court records from 13th century Yorkshire show a widow named Alice fined 3 shillings for gathering deadwood, while a man caught doing the same had his axe hand branded. This disparity wasn't mercy, it reflected patriarchal views of women as economically dependent. A blinded or maimed woman became a burden on the community, while a fined one could still labor or remarry. Yet these lighter punishments could be equally devastating. A peasant woman stripped of her meager savings by forest fines might starve that winter, a slower violence than the executioner's blade. Some women turned the system's biases to their advantage. Widows like Marjorie Kemp of Rockingham Forest inherited their husbands' roles as foresters' assistants, patrolling woodland edges for poachers. Account rolls from Edward I's reign reveal at least 17 women managing coppice plots, harvesting young trees for royal shipbuilding under license. These rare positions offered fleeting autonomy. Marjorie's ledger shows she negotiated timber prices with royal clerks, a startling glimpse of female agency in a male-dominated world. But such opportunities came with strings. Women foresters were often barred from carrying weapons, making them vulnerable to retaliation, and their authority vanished if they remarried. The laws also weaponized gender norms to enforce control. Women gathering herbs or mushrooms, traditionally female tasks, faced less scrutiny than men hunting, but were still fined for overstepping invisible boundaries. Church sermons portrayed female foragers as temptresses luring men into poaching, a trope that justified harsher collective punishments. In one chilling case from 1289, an entire Derbyshire village had its grazing rights revoked after elders claimed women had smuggled venison in their laundry baskets. The message was clear: women's daily survival work could endanger whole communities. Domestic spaces became sites of quiet rebellion. Hearthside tales passed from mothers to daughters taught hidden uses for legal plants: willow bark for pain, nettles for soup when crops failed. Some housewives kept secret cellars stocked with poached game, while others sewed deer hide into sheepskin gloves. These acts weren't just practical, they preserved knowledge the laws tried to erase. A Lincolnshire ballad from the era sneers at foresters searching cottages in vain while the goodwife's kettle sings with the king's own deer. Climate shifts upended these precarious balances. The Little Ice Age's arrival in the early 1400s brought famines that forced women into riskier defiance. With crops failing, foraging wasn't a choice but a necessity, and royal foresters, facing their own hungry families, often looked the other way. Parish records note surges in widows' thefts of firewood during harsh winters, while chroniclers describe mothers and children stripping bark from royal oaks to make famine bread. Nature's changing rhythms, not just human laws, now dictated who survived in the shadow of the king's trees. The bitterest irony: women's unpaid labor sustained the system that oppressed them. They wove the nets used in royal hunts, stitched the liveries of foresters, and even nursed wounded deer back to health, all while barred from sharing the bounty. Their unseen work kept the forests running, a dynamic that would echo in later industrial revolutions. Yet their stories, like the hidden paths they used to forage, remind us that oppression is never absolute. Between the lines of court rolls and ballads, you can still hear the rustle of skirts in forbidden clearings, the quiet defiance of hands that fed families first and kings last. As temperatures dropped and harvests failed, even the crown's iron grip on the forests began to falter. The laws that had seemed immutable for centuries were about to meet a force no king could control: the changing climate itself. The bitter winters of the Little Ice Age didn't just freeze rivers, they cracked the very foundations of medieval forest laws. Beginning in the early 1300s, a climatic shift plunged Europe into centuries of erratic harvests, failing crops, and desperate hunger. As frozen fields yielded no grain, peasants turned to forbidden royal forests in waves, risking mutilation for a mouthful of poached venison or a bundle of stolen firewood. Where foresters once patrolled with measured brutality, they now wielded unchecked violence, blinding offenders publicly, leaving bodies dangling from boundary oaks as warnings. Yet the harsher the punishments grew, the more futile they became. Starvation, it turned out, was a more potent force than fear. This collision of climate and law revealed the system's fatal flaw: rigidity. Designed for stable times, forest laws had no mechanism to adjust when nature itself rebelled. Royal deer, already overpopulated due to predator eradication, now starved alongside peasants, their emaciated carcasses littering snowbound clearings. Officials responded with absurd cruelty. In 1347, a Nottinghamshire man was hanged for skinning a deer that had already frozen to death. Such draconian measures backfired spectacularly. Villagers who once informed on poachers now sheltered them, sharing clandestine feasts of king's meat in hidden clearings. The forest, once a symbol of royal control, became a battleground for survival. Economic records from the period tell a damning story. Fines for forest offenses plummeted, not because compliance improved, but because starving peasants had nothing left to give. In Suffolk, entire villages abandoned their homes to become forest-dwelling outlaws, living in makeshift shelters like the displaced populations of modern climate disasters. Meanwhile, the Crown's own finances buckled under the strain. Maintaining deer herds through brutal winters required costly imported fodder, while plummeting timber prices, thanks to collapsed construction during famines, drained royal coffers. The very laws meant to extract wealth from nature were now bleeding the treasury dry. Yet from this chaos emerged unexpected reforms. Faced with mass unrest and empty coffers, Edward Roman III made a historic concession in 1339, the Ordinance of the Forest. For the first time, peasants could legally gather deadwood and graze livestock in royal woods during declared famines. It wasn't mercy, it was cold calculus. Better to bend the rules than watch them shatter entirely. Similar adjustments spread across Europe. French kings allowed emergency hunting in royal reserves, while German lords temporarily suspended timber tariffs. These weren't acts of enlightenment, but desperate patches on a crumbling system. The Little Ice Age's true lesson wasn't just about medieval laws, it's a warning for our climate crisis today. When environmental policies prioritize control over adaptability, they fail both people and ecosystems. The forest law's downfall came not from their cruelty, but from their inability to respond when the world changed. As glaciers advanced and harvests failed, the Crown kept enforcing rules written for a warmer, richer era, just as modern governments cling to water rights or fishing quotas drafted before ocean acidification or megadroughts. History whispers this truth: no law is stronger than the climate that shapes it. Art would soon capture this unraveling, not in dry court records, but in vivid pigments and woven threads that revealed how forests lived in the medieval imagination. Medieval tapestries and illuminated manuscripts didn't just decorate castle walls, they were propaganda tools, weaving royal authority into the very fabric of nature. The famous Devonshire hunting tapestries, stitched with golden threads in the 1500s, show more than just nobles chasing deer. They depict a world where every leaf, stream, and animal exists solely for the king's pleasure. Forests appear as meticulously ordered grids, trees spaced like soldiers at attention, while hunting dogs move in perfect formation. This wasn't artistic license, it was political messaging. By portraying nature as obedient to royal command, these artworks reinforced the idea that disorder, whether in the form of rebellious peasants or untamed wilderness, was unnatural. Even the colors carried meaning. The exclusive use of expensive blues and crimsons reminded viewers that only the Crown could afford such splendor, tying ecological control to economic power. Religious art amplified this symbolism. Stained glass windows in cathedrals showed saints blessing royal hunts, while psalters illustrated Bible stories with backgrounds of fenced deer parks. A 13th-century English prayer book goes further. It depicts Adam and Eve exiled from Eden into a landscape marked with royal boundary stones, conflating divine punishment with forest law penalties. These images taught an insidious lesson. Challenging the king's control over nature wasn't just illegal, it was sinful. The Renaissance brought subtle subversion. Hidden in the margins of hunting scenes, sharp-eyed viewers might spot a peasant family gathering firewood in the distance, or a fox stealing a pheasant. Quiet nods to the reality behind the pageantry. More daring artists used symbolism. A fallen tree in one German woodcut mirrors a beheaded poacher in the foreground, linking ecological and human exploitation. These details, easily missed by censors, became visual protests against a system that turned living forests into aristocratic stage sets. Romantic painters centuries later would flip the script entirely. Where medieval art showed nature on its knees, works like Caspar David Friedrich's The Chasseur in the Forest, 1814, portray woodlands as vengeful and alive, a French soldier dwarfed by towering pines after Napoleon's defeat. The message was clear: human authority over nature is fleeting. Even the style betrayed this shift. Gone were the tidy lines of tapestries, replaced by wild brushstrokes that made forests seem to breathe. This wasn't just artistic evolution, it was the cultural aftershock of forest law's collapse, as societies reimagined wilderness not as property, but as a force unto itself. The most haunting legacy lies in heraldry. Noble families adopted plants and animals from royal forests as coats of arms, not despite their oppression, but because of it. A stag on a shield wasn't just a pretty emblem, it declared, "I am privileged enough to hunt what you cannot." These symbols, still visible on everything from pub signs to soccer jerseys, are living fossils of a time when art wasn't just about beauty, but about who held the right to define nature's place in the human world. Yet amid all this pageantry, one document dared to challenge the visual narrative: the Charter of the Forest, a radical text that treated woodlands as communal lifelines rather than royal backdrops. Its existence proved that even in an age of crafted imagery, some truths couldn't be stitched away or painted over. The Charter of the Forest wasn't just a piece of parchment, it was a seismic shift in how society viewed nature's rightful owners. Signed in 1217 as a companion to the Magna Carta, this revolutionary document did something unheard of. It declared that forests weren't just royal playgrounds, but vital lifelines for ordinary people. Where previous laws had barred peasants from so much as picking up fallen branches, the Charter restored ancient rights to forage firewood, graze livestock, and even hunt small game. For the first time in over a century, the smell of wood smoke in a peasant's hut didn't carry the threat of mutilation. But this wasn't just about firewood, it was about redefining power. The Charter's 32 clauses read like a medieval bill of rights for the land. One groundbreaking provision banned the death penalty for poaching deer, replacing it with fines scaled to the offender's means. Another dismantled the hated lawing of dogs, ending the brutal practice of claw removal. Most radically, it ordered the disafforestation of lands seized since Henry Roman II reign, forcing the Crown to return nearly a third of royal forests to common use. These weren't minor adjustments, they were direct challenges to the idea that nature could be monopolized by any single person. The Charter's brilliance lay in its granular practicality. Unlike lofty philosophical manifestos, it addressed daily survival: the right to take a dead and down wood for hearth fires, to dig clay for house repairs, to let pigs root for acorns in season. It even protected access to waterways, medieval England's original public utilities. These specifics gave it teeth. Villagers could now point to exact clauses when corrupt foresters demanded bribes for basic activities. Yet the Charter's true legacy is how it bridged environmental and social justice centuries before those concepts had names. By linking peasant rights to sustainable land use, like limiting grazing during fawn season, it acknowledged that human survival and ecological health were intertwined. Modern scholars see it as a missing link between indigenous stewardship traditions and contemporary conservation models. When protesters today invoke public trust doctrine to challenge private water bottling plants or pipeline projects, they're channeling the Charter's core principle: some resources are too vital to be owned. The parchment itself barely survived. Original copies were carried across England by circuit judges, read aloud at county courts until the ink faded and edges frayed. One surviving copy at Durham Cathedral still bears wax stains where generations of peasants pressed their seals to reaffirm its terms. This physical fragility makes its endurance as a legal concept all the more remarkable, like a dandelion pushing through castle stone. What the Charter couldn't do was erase centuries of learned fear. Even after 1217, many villagers hesitated to exercise their restored rights, conditioned by generations of brutal enforcement. Some foresters, loath to relinquish power, intentionally misread clauses or invented new fees. The tension between parchment and practice revealed an eternal truth: laws change faster than human instincts. Today, the Charter's DNA surfaces in unexpected places. Scotland's landmark Land Reform Act of 2003, which guaranteed public access to wilderness, directly cited its medieval predecessor. Bolivia's law of Mother Earth borrows its ethos of balancing human needs with ecological limits. Even the UN's Sustainable Development Goals echo its vision of nature as shared sustenance rather than private property. The Charter's most subversive legacy might be its quiet rebuke to the idea that environmental progress follows a straight line. Written 800 years ago, during what we'd call the Dark Ages, it proved that societies can regress as easily as advance, and that justice sometimes requires looking backward for wisdom. As climate change and land grabs again threaten equitable access to nature, this yellowed medieval document offers a rallying cry: forests belong to the future, not just the powerful. Medieval forest laws were never just about trees and deer. They were a masterclass in how power shapes the natural world to serve its own ends. The echoes of those ancient rules still whisper through modern debates. Who gets to decide which patches of earth remain wild and which become parking lots or pipelines? When a government today designates a protected wetland or bans logging in an old-growth forest, the ghost of William the Conqueror nods in recognition. The methods have evolved. No one blinds poachers anymore, but the fundamental tension remains the same. Can we protect ecosystems without repeating history's mistakes, where conservation becomes another word for control? The brutal irony of these laws is that their unintended consequences often outlasted their cruelty. Royal forests, meant to preserve game for elite sport, accidentally safeguarded biodiversity by default. Ancient oaks that would have been cleared for medieval farmland still stand today because kings valued them as hunting landmarks. Yet this ecological windfall came at a human cost: displaced communities, shattered traditions, and generations taught to see nature as something fenced off and forbidden. Modern conservation grapples with the same paradox. How do we protect endangered species without creating green fortresses where only scientists and tourists are welcome? There's a lesson here about the fragility of top-down control. Forest laws collapsed not because peasants revolted, but because they became too cumbersome to enforce. Climate shifts, black markets, and sheer human ingenuity wore down the system's foundations. Today's environmental policies risk the same fate if they ignore local knowledge or prioritize punishment over partnership. The success of community-managed forests from Nepal to Norway suggests an alternative, one that blends medieval clarity about boundaries with indigenous wisdom about shared stewardship. So where does that leave us? The Charter of the Forest's 800-year-old promise that nature must serve survival, not just power, feels startlingly relevant as droughts and wildfires rewrite our relationship with the land. Maybe the real legacy of those medieval laws isn't in the parchment or the penalties, but in the stubborn human instinct to push back when told, "This doesn't belong to you." The forests never did belong to kings, just as clean air and fresh water can't truly be owned by corporations or states. They're part of a contract between generations, written not in ink but in roots and rivers. As you close this chapter, consider this. Every time you walk through a public park or drink from a protected watershed, you're benefiting from centuries of struggle over who controls nature. The battle those medieval peasants fought for access, for dignity, for a say in the ecosystems that sustain them isn't over. It's just moved to new terrain. So the next time you see a "no trespassing" sign or hear about a disputed oil pipeline, ask yourself, who's drawing the boundaries now? And more importantly, who gets to rewrite them? Drop your thoughts below. Have we really moved beyond medieval ideas of ownership, or are we just better at hiding the fences? If you found this dive into history's hidden landscapes eye-opening, don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys into the past that shape our present. And remember, the best way to honor those who fought for the right to breathe free air is to keep questioning who gets to decide what nature is for. Until next time, keep wandering. Just watch out for boundaries.